Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. We also have a ton of brand new t-shirt designs in stock, so make sure you check out those as well. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG Player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in for the Commander's Core Studio. Welcome to the show. Today's episode comes to you courtesy of my amazing patrons. Once a month, patrons vote on what commander that they'd like to see in an upcoming deck tag. The commander that gets the most votes wins. And the commander that they chose for this month's episode is Old Stickfingers. Old Stickfingers is a star horror that costs X black-green. It has, when you cast this spell, reveal cards to the top of your library to reveal X creature cards. Put all creature cards revealed this way into your graveyard, then put the rest of them on your library in a random order. And of course, on top of that, Old Stickfingers' power and toughness are each equal to the number of creature cards in your graveyard. Now, Old Stickfingers, well, first off, has one of the best names in Magic history, in my opinion, but I've also highlighted this card in a couple of episodes. And in those episodes, I talked about, well, how this commander can be built in a couple of different ways. One way might be a little more competitive and focusing on just comboing off with a certain number of creatures, like maybe there's 2 creatures that combo, so you just put 2 into that X, you only have those 2 creatures in your deck, and you always get them into your graveyard, then you reanimate them, and then you win. However, that is not going to be the direction that I am taking this deck, and in this deck, we're going to be focusing on getting a lot of massive creatures into our graveyard, getting them back out, and having some fun from there. Also, although the creatures in this deck are massive, the cost is not, because every single card in this deck, including the commander, is less than $1. So with all that said, let's jump into it. First up, let's actually start off with the Golden Pig of this deck, which is the number 1 card out of our 99. And the Golden Pig for this deck is Victimize. It's a sorcery for 2 and a black, and it says choose 2 target creature cards in your graveyard, sacrifice a creature. If you do, return the chosen cards to the battlefield tapped. So Victimize kind of, in a way, just encapsulates exactly what this deck wants to do. After you've gotten the massive creatures in your graveyard, well, let's just get a couple of them out. And, while we're at it, maybe we can also just, sacrifice our commander so we can help get more creatures into our graveyard. Or maybe we've got a creature that makes a lot of tokens when it comes into play, and then we can sacrifice one of those tokens for 2 big monsters. So yeah, a 3 mana reanimate 2 creature spell for the cost of 1 creature. That's an incredible card, especially in a deck like this, and yeah, we'll get to some of those big heavy hitters here in a bit, but yeah, Victimize is a fantastic card, and it is most definitely the Golden Pig of this deck. Moving on though, of course, we've got a lot of other reanimate cards in this deck, and let's start off with Zombify, Vigor Mortis, and Dread Return. Zombify just straight up says, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Very simple, but very effective. And then Vigor Mortis essentially does the exact same thing, but if green was spent to cast the spell, which again, this is a, black-green deck, so most likely we're going to be using green at some point, that creature enters the battlefield with an additional +1 counter on it. So a slightly bigger baddie. And then Dread Return says return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, and it's got flashback, sacrifice 3 creatures. Again, sacrificing our commander in a lot of situations is actually a good thing because, well, we can recast our commander to get more creatures into our graveyard. And again, like I mentioned before, we've also got ways to make tokens, so there's that too. Moving on though, we've got an instant speed reanimation spell with Makeshift Mannequin. Basically, it brings back a creature with a mannequin counter on it, and if that creature is ever the target of a spell or ability, we have to sacrifice it. Next up, for 1 more mana, we've got Unbreakable Bond, which is going to return target creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield with a lifelink counter on it. And then Diagraph Rebirth also costs 5 mana, but it can actually cost less. It says the spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature that died this turn, so it can cost, just 2 mana. And on top of that, this is a reanimation spell that can also be flashed back. Next up though, let's talk about a reanimation spell that also helps out in a different way with Back for More. It's an instant that says, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. When you do, it fights up to 1 target creature you don't control. So, instant speed, reanimation, and removal, yeah, sign me up for that. And then we're also going to be running Yawgmoth's Vile Offering, which is a legendary sorcery that says put up to one target creature, planeswalker card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control, destroy up to one target creature or planeswalker, exile Yawgmoth's Vile Offering. So this actually lets us bring something back either from our graveyard or an opponent's graveyard, and on top of that, we can destroy either a creature or a planeswalker. Speaking of bringing things back from any graveyard, there's Beacon of Unrest, which says put target artifact or creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control, shuffle Beacon of Unrest into its owner's library. So this reanimation spell that we can actually get back again. Moving on though, let's talk about some ways to reanimate multiple creatures with Ever After, Boneyard Parlay, and the Cauldron of Eternity. Ever After is a sorcery that says return up to 2 target creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. Each of those creatures is a black zombie to its other types. Put Ever After on the bottom of its owner's library. 2 creatures for 6 mana is a great deal, especially once you see the creatures in this deck. Speaking of which, there's Boneyard Parlay, which is kind of like a fact or fiction, but for getting creatures out. Let's just go over it real quick. Exile up to 5 target creature cards from graveyards, and opponent separates those cards into 2 piles. Put all the cards from the pile of your choice onto the battlefield under your control, and the rest in the owner's graveyard. And then the Cauldron of Eternity is an interesting card in this deck that you kind of have to be careful with when you play. It's a legendary artifact for 10 black, but it's going to cost 2 less to cast for each creature card in our graveyard. So a lot of the time for this kind of deck, we can actually just have this cost 2 mana. And it says, whenever a creature you control dies, put it on the bottom of its owner's library. So again, be careful because you probably don't want to put this out too early because, well, creatures dying and going back into our graveyard is not a bad thing. That being said, its activated ability is fantastic in this deck. Pay 2 and a black and tap and pay 2 life. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate this ability only anytime you cast a sorcery. So yeah, if we're set up with a good amount of creatures in our graveyard already, getting this out for a very cheap and repeatable reanimation effect can be a fantastic play. And finally, let's talk about Whisper Blood Liturgist, a 2/2 human cleric for 3 and a black that has tap, sacrifice 2 creatures, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Again, sacrificing our commander in a lot of circumstances is the right play, and again, on top of that, like I mentioned before a couple of times now, we also have ways to make a lot of tokens in this deck. So there are plenty of powerful things that we can do with this to abuse ETBs. But now let's move on to talk about those heavy hitters in this deck that we want to get out. First up, let's talk about Sepulchral Primordial, Rakshasa Debaser, and Lorcan Warlock Collector. Sepulchral Primordial is a 5/4 Intimidate that has, when it enters the battlefield, for each opponent, you may put up to 1 target creature card from that player's graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. So yeah, a 5/4 Intimidate that also can give us up to 3 creatures from opponents' graveyards. Sign me up. And speaking of getting cards out of our opponent's graveyards, how about Rakshasa Debaser, a 6/6 cat demon that has, whenever it attacks, put target creature card from an defending player's graveyard on the battlefield under your control, and it's got Encore. So again, our commander can actually get this into our graveyard, and then we Encore it out to go steal, 3 creatures while also attacking everyone for 6. And speaking of pretty much stealing creatures, let's talk about Lorcan Warlock Collector, a 6/6 with flying that has, whenever a creature card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, you may pay life equal to its mana value. If you do, put it onto the battlefield under your control. It's a Warlock and its other types. If a Warlock you control would die, exile it instead. So yeah, there are going to be plenty of creatures out there that are going to be definitely worth some life to pay to actually get them into play under our control. And speaking of getting even more creatures into play under our control, how about Thieving Amalgam? It has, at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, you manifest the top card of that player's library, so basically you get it off the top of their library into play face down as a 2/2 creature, and you can turn it up by paying its mana cost if it's a creature. On top of that, whenever a creature you control but don't own dies, its owner loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. Next up though, how about Moldgraph Monstrosity, an 8/8 trampling insect that has, when it dies, exile it, then return 2 target creature cards at random from your graveyard to the battlefield. The way that this deck was built, we really only have heavy hitters in this deck, so when this dies, we're going to get 2 massive things back. Like perhaps Artisan of Kozilek, a 10/9 with Annihilator 2. On top of that, if we actually cast it, we get to reanimate a creature from our graveyard. Moving on though, now let's talk about some of those token makers with cards like Hornet Queen, Verdant Force, and Azoni. Hornet Queen is a 2/2 with Flying and Death Touch, and when it enters the battlefield, we get 4 1/1 green insect creature tokens with Flying and Death Touch. With this in play, we are most definitely going to be controlling the skies. And of course, we can control the ground as well with Verdant Force, a 7/7 elemental that says at the beginning of each upkeep, create a 1/1 green sapling creature token. Keep in mind, that's each upkeep, not just our own, so again, 1 trip around the table is 4 tokens. We can also make a ton of tokens though with Azoni, which has Undergrowth. When it enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 black and green insect creature token for each creature card in your graveyard. On top of that, by paying black-green, we can sacrifice another creature to gain 1 life and draw a card, so that's always nice too. Moving on though, we've got Abhorrent Overlord, a 6/6 flying demon that has, when it enters the battlefield, put a number of 1/1 black harpy creature tokens of flying onto the battlefield equal to Devotion to Black. And on top of that, at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice a creature. And again, when it comes to sacrificing creatures in this deck, that's not really all that bad of a thing. Next up though, we've got Giant Adiphagy, a 7/7 insect with trample that has, when it deals combat damage to a player, create a token that's a copy of Giant Adiphagy. So this can get out of control pretty quickly. Speaking of which, there's Triplicate Titan, a 9/9 golem with flying, vigilance, and trample, and when it dies, it splits into 3/3/3s that each have one of those keywords. Next up though, how about an 11/11 trampling dinosaur beast with Titanoth Rex that we can actually just get into our graveyard on its own by cycling it. On top of that, when we do cycle it, we can put a trample counter on target creature we control. And speaking of helping creatures out, how about Necropolis Region, a 6/5 flying vampire that says whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, put that many +1 counters on it. So just one hit with some massive creatures can make them even deadlier. And speaking of making them deadlier, of course we're going to be running End-Raze Forerunners, a 7/7 vigilant, trample, hasty boar that has, when it enters the battlefield, other creatures you control get +2/+2 and gain vigilance and trample until end of turn. So swing out to your heart's desire and smack your opponents for a ton. But the final card that I'm going to be covering in this section is Dawnglade Regent, an 8/8 elk that has, when it enters the battlefield, you become the monarch, and as long as you're the monarch, permanents you control have hexproof. Monarch is great for an aggressive deck like this that, well, can pretty easily keep hitting opponents. So we can generate some card advantage while also protecting our things. But now that we've actually talked about some of our plans, how do we throw a wrench into our opponent's plans? Well, we can start to do that with some heavy hitters like Thorn Mammoth, Terrastodon, and Overseer of the Damned. Thorn Mammoth is a 6/6 with trample that has, whenever it or other creature enters the battlefield under your control, Thorn Mammoth fights up to one target creature you don't control. So this can just keep fighting throughout the game, taking out creature after creature after creature. And then Terrastodon is a 9/9 elephant that has, when it enters the battlefield, it may destroy up to 3 target non-creature permanents. For each permanent put into a graveyard this way, its controller creates a 3/3 green elephant creature token. So this can take out a lot of things, actually including some of our stuff if we actually want some of those tokens. And speaking of making tokens, Overseer of the Damned is a 5/5 flying demon that has, when it enters the battlefield, you may destroy target creature. And on top of that, whenever a non-token creature an opponent controls dies, create a tap 2/2 black zombie creature token. Moving on though, next up we've got some more heavy hitters that can also take out our opponent's things with Ulamog's Crusher and Butcher of Malakir. Ulamog's Crusher is an 8/8 with Annihilator 2 that has to attack each combat if able, and again, we're happy to do so. And then Butcher of Malakir is a 5/4 flying vampire warrior that has, whenever it or the creature you control dies, each opponent sacrifices a creature. So yeah, this thing can be absolutely brutal. I mean, just think about it in combination with some token makers and, Whisper. That can get ugly. We also, of course, have some more standard removal spells with things like Wilt, Return to Nature, and Beast Within. Wilt's can destroy target artifact or enchantment, or we can cycle it for 2. Return to Nature can either destroy an artifact or an enchantment, or we can exile target card from a graveyard. And then Beast Within's going to destroy a target permanent, and its controller creates a 3/3 green beast creature token. Moving on though, next up we're going to be running Binding of the Old Gods, which its first lore counter says destroy target non-land permanent an opponent controls. Its second lore counter says search your library for a forest card, put it onto the battlefield, tap, then shuffle your library. And its third lore counter says creatures you control gain Death Touch until end of turn. So this can wipe out a pesky permanent, ramp us, and then also help our creatures become incredibly deadly. And then Casualties of War can deal with a lot of things. It says choose one or more, destroy target artifact, creature, enchantment, land, and planeswalker. Next up, Necromantic Selection says destroy all creatures and return a creature card put into a graveyard this way to the battlefield under your control. It's a black zombie that shoots other colors and types, exile Necromantic Selection. Basically, wipe everything out and get one thing back. And speaking of wiping everything out, there's Gaze of Granite, which says destroy each non-land permanent with mana value X or less. With this kind of a deck, this can very easily become a one-sided board wipe by putting the right amount of mana into it. We've got a lot of heavy hitters that have a very high converted mana cost that we're basically going to cheat and play by reanimating them, so, well, we just pay underneath their cost and everything else goes bye-bye. But how are we actually going to get to all these great cards? Well, we've actually got some big creatures that can help us with card advantage as well with Soul the Harvest, Harvester of Souls, and Ulvenwald Observer. Soul the Harvest is a 6/6 with trample that says whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. And then Harvester of Souls is a 5/5 demon with Death Touch that says whenever another non-token creature dies, you may draw a card. And then Ulvenwald Observer is a 6/6 tree folk that says whenever a creature you control a toughness 4 or greater dies, draw a card. Again, the vast majority, pretty much all the creatures in this deck meet that requirement, so yeah, this can also draw us a lot of cards. And while we're talking about drawing cards, let's talk about more of our standard draw spells with Ancient Craving, Ambition's Cost, Harmonize, Read the Bone, Sign in Blood, Dark Bargain, and Moonlight Bargain. And actually those bargain cards are fantastic ways to get even more big creatures into our graveyard. Dark Bargain says look at the top 3 cards of your library, put 2 of them in your hand and the other in your graveyard. Dark Bargain deals 2 damage to you. And then Moonlight Bargain says look at the top 5 cards of your library. For each card, put that card in your graveyard unless you pay 2 life, then put the rest in your hand. And finally, since we're going through lists of cards, let's quickly go through the ramp in this deck. We're going to be running Font of Fertility, Talisman of Resilience, Wild Growth, Explore, Edge of Autumn, Search for Tomorrow, Cultivate, Harrow, Growth from the Ashes, and Rampant Growth. But now that we've talked about every single non-land card in this deck, let's talk about the price. And like I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, every single card in this deck is less than $1, including the commanders, so our estimated cost comes out to $36.57. And actually, keep in mind that this estimated cost does include the cost of basic lands at 10 cents a piece, so if you have those already, there's some extra savings there. And speaking of potential extra savings, if you buy this deck on TCG Player, you might be able to save even more by utilizing heavily played and damaged cards, which of course need a home too. Though do keep in mind that this estimated cost does not include the cost of shipping, which might vary depending upon where you live. And with that, the show is coming to a close, so it's my turn here from you. So in the comments below, let me know your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one.